Well, thank you for being here and being ready. And so I get to simply turn it over to the extraordinarily talented, smart, challenging, truth-telling Dr. Lisa Davison.
Thank you. I've been called a lot of things. Those are some of the nicer ones, I will say. Just a reminder for folks who may not have been at the dinner or slept like I did and may not remember everything that was said at the dinner. We're going to introduce ourselves one more time with our name and what we do. And then we've got some questions that we will be discussing. And after that, we will open the floor, and we really want you all to help us have this conversation more broadly. So I am Lisa Davison, Johnny Ergel Cadjo, Professor of Hebrew Bible and Director of Formation for Disciple Students. And that's all you need to know about me.
I'm Peter Capretto. I'm Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care in Religion and Culture.
I'm Kathy McCallie, and I'm the Associate Professor of Ministerial Leadership and Ethics. I'm also the Spiritual Formation Director for students in the United Church of Christ.
I'm Brianna Wong. I am Assistant Professor of the History of World Christianities.
I'm Lisa Barnett. I'm an assistant professor of American religious history that of course includes disciples' history, but it also includes Native American religious beliefs and practices as well.
All right. Thank you all for being here. And I was so excited when I found out that the panel was my colleagues, because I was like, oh no, if it's a bunch of people I don't know, then I'm going to have to worry about whether I ask the right questions. And then I got more intimidated because they are my colleagues. And so I said, why don't I ask them? What questions could I ask that would allow you to talk about teaching for transforming justice? And they obliged. So we're going to take a fractal approach. Oh, he's not in the room. I actually listened and learned about fractal. We're going to start with some more up-close questions about teaching, and then we'll broaden out as we move through the questions. So the first question, when we start our process of dreaming up and getting ready to teach a course, one of the things we have to do is create a syllabus. And so the question is, in what ways does your approach to course design reflect your commitment to justice as a theological educator? And we're going to no order, just whoever wants to speak.
All right, don't be shy. I'll jump in. I think for me, particularly with the history of Christianity, I did one until Dr. Wong came to take that one. I do two now. But even with disciples' history, I always include the word power in my syllabus, that it's important to look at systems of power at work in institutions to see who has the power, how historically they wield it over others who don't have the power, and what happens, i.e. with Christianity, when they got the power, how instead of doing the right thing towards justice, they ended up themselves becoming a system of institutional religion. So power is always a word when I design a syllabus that I like to look at, that we examine more in depth. And then readings, of course, to complement that. Voices from those in power, of course, writing history, but those voices who have been silenced and trying to bring them back into a historical conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Barnett. I can probably, talk on that a little bit as well, someone also in the history department. When I was in undergrad, it seemed like anybody who ever had anything important to say, according to our curriculum, must have been an old white man who lived a very long time ago. And so I think that it's very difficult to break out of that. And so when I started having the opportunity to make my own syllabi, I wanted to be very intentional about centering voices from the margins. Where were the women? Because women were always there. Where were where were the people who were ethnic minorities, people who were oppressed in different ways? What were they saying? What were they doing? Can we read between the lines to find what kind of theologies they were putting forth? And so that's something that I think about when I try to create a justice-oriented syllabus.
Same. That's an important thing to think about in terms of the book lists. I'm always looking at book lists, and in the fields of philosophy and in political theory and leadership, also very dominated by what was traditionally called the canon in higher ed. And so being sure to amplify marginalized voices and think about bringing lots of different perspectives into the reading list to make sure that there's diversity in the reading list. And also, I spend time thinking about, often in our classes, because they're sometimes small, so if we only have 12 people, it hasn't been unusual for me in classes to have only 1 or 2 persons of color in the room. And so thinking about then the taxing that can be for people who may feel isolated or a different kind of contextual relationship to the material than I have. So I think about that. One more thing I'll add that's new for me that I've been struggling with is the justice issue of academic integrity in a world where so many people get their papers, and now there's this whole artificial intelligence thing for crafting papers. So thinking about how to try and design assignments to avoid putting people in that situation.
Well, not surprisingly, I have a lot of overlap and agreement with my colleagues, particularly on diversity of sources and content. A little bit of a different direction taking the justice issue. Justice matters always pertain to issues of exclusion and power related to accessibility of materials. I will say one of the biggest turnarounds for me in thinking about justice in my course designs has been around the matter of accessibility itself of materials, and I'm talking quite literally about the ability of for students to digest the material that is presented in a syllabus. And if this is feeling a bit vague for you, the very first syllabus that I developed as a graduate student was very serious and impressive looking, and it was blocks and blocks of text. I love, for the style nerds, Perpetua, a very nice serif font that I would have in nice tight blocks with justified margins. It was probably about a 7,000 to 8,000 word syllabus, so detailed. It was a fortress, and it was misery to work through. And I learned, if I'm being completely honest, I developed that syllabus for other professors and for other people who were already part of this educational system. So it has taken me several years to even begin to reformat course designs with hyperlinks, with very sensitive, accessible text that actually people with perhaps learning disabilities, or even people who don't have learning disabilities and who simply are a little bit fatigued in their attention. I could go on for hours about all the ways that this has been a learning opportunity for me, but justice in pedagogy means giving educational power to more persons who were not previously included, and really granular details about course design I see as very much not below us as theologians, and I would say that this also extends to anyone who's generating theological material for congregations and faith nonprofits.
It made me realize another concern, and we talk about this as a faculty, it's not just mine, is the cost of books. Yes. Because that's another justice issue and accessibility issue. And like one of the favorite books I like to use in an ethics class costs about $150 for one book. And so I've decided not to use that book anymore, but to draw a few articles from that book. There's a limit that we can copy and post through the library site. So even choices like that we're thinking about.
Anybody else want to add something now that you've heard your colleagues speak? No? Okay. Good. I'm thinking, since we brought up the topic of sources and book lists, can you think of a theologian, or I'll just say an author in general, that you introduce your students to in your courses that you think students have found them, that resource to be especially inspired in helping them work towards transforming justice? And I can make one suggestion. I do teach here, so I guess I should. And the Bible department is sorely represented here. So one example, and this is actually a very old text. I won't tell you how old it is, but in Intro to Hebrew Bible, when we get to Joshua and Judges, I have students read Robert Warrier's Canaanites, Indians, and Cowboys, that talks about reading the story of Exodus, or entry into the Promised Land, from the side of the people who were already in the land, and how liberation for one group is oppressive for other groups. And we don't always read those stories in quite that critical way, because we're cheering on our team when they come into the Promised Land and not thinking about the implications that story has had in many directions, but particularly with indigenous populations in this country, and how that narrative of the conquest was used as part and parcel of why we have this new promised land. So I gave you time to think. Now.
Well, I'll just mention one that people have strong reactions to, and some students love Adrienne Maree Brown, and a more contemporary voice and an activist voice in some kinds of organizational leadership movements. Other students don't like her work, and so, but there's some that just really rave about her.
You want to say it a bit more in case not everybody in this room knows who she is, or a title of a book?
She has Pleasure Activism is one of the books. There are a number of books that she's written and published, but she's known in leadership literature in really contemporary, more young activist circles, and not so much in theological or church circles, but probably in social justice movement circles.
I know it sounds a little weird, but for Disciples History, I assign Shonda Jaws room at the table. She is not a self-proclaimed historian, but it is one of the first times in Disciples history that someone was attempting to write the non-white view of Disciples history and put it out there in print. And so I assign it, and Disciples students just love being exposed, and that's the direction then that the class that I take. What are the stories besides the 4 white men that founded the movement, in which African Americans were involved, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and we look at different groups and try to put those voices into the larger history of the Stone Campbell movement. So that's one. I think it's important for history too, as well as American religious history, to also not forget Native Americans in terms of, the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Muskogee and the Ponca and the Tonkawa and those groups, but Inuits from Alaska and Native Hawaiians whose culture was also decimated as a result of missionary colonialism partnered with the state tool of capitalism coming in with plantations, pineapple plantations and things like that, taking away their culture, and ways that Native Hawaiians are working to also restore traditional religious practices. And so those are some of the books that we try to read and some of the topics that we try to discuss as well.
Okay, I'm going to do the terrible professor thing and give too many names, but I'll move through them quickly. I'll mention two briefly. Shaniqua Walker Barnes, a womanist pastoral theologian, her text, I Bring the Voice of My People, is a fantastic text on racial reconciliation that students in a few courses have enjoyed. My close friend and colleague, Hillary Jerome Scarcella, a constructive theologian at Colgate, Rochester, Crozier Divinity School. If anyone is interested in looking into making congregations focused on survivor-centered approaches, her work is fantastic. But the two texts that I will say that the question is about what have students responded to most. So I'm going to cheat and I'm going to give two. One, I teach a course on empathy and the ethics of pastoral care, and there is a text from a scholar of womanist comparative literature named Saadia Hartman. She has a text called Scenes of Subjection, where she, focusing on 19th century abolitionist literature, focuses on the very complex way that empathy functions both as a resource for movements of liberation and also as a terrible hindrance to it, which is a very vexing thing for students to wrestle with, this idea that centering the empathy, particularly of persons in positions of power, can actually have very deleterious effects on justice movements. The second one, which is also in a counterintuitive vein, but the text that students have probably responded most enthusiastically to, is Melissa Florer-Bixler's How to Have an Enemy, which is a text that I've taught in my political pastoral theology course, which, provocative title, yes, don't gasp too much, but it is a text that essentially is, I will say, it's not that the sole audience is on white liberals, but I will say that the primary audience is there, white liberals who seem to be a bit allergic to the idea that, oh, I might have an adversarial relationship with someone, and that might actually be a necessary step to certain forms of justice building. Of course, it polarizes the classroom, I think, in productive ways, but almost everyone who's read that text has said that they've taken quite a bit from it.
Wow, thanks everybody. I'm gonna have to read all these books now. I just finished teaching a January intensive course for DMin and master's students on Christianity in Africa in the history department, and two of the authors that the students really latched on to were John Mbiti, a Kenyan theologian, and then Desmond Tutu, of course the Archbishop in South Africa. And I think from Mbiti, what students came away with was this idea that Christianity equals the gospel plus culture. There's no pure form of Christianity floating out there. And many of the different forms of Christianity that have been most harmful have been those that are combined with aspects of culture that are harmful. But that doesn't mean that Christianity in and of itself needs to be tossed out. And I think that was something that was empowering for students, helpful in processing different painful memories and very difficult stories related to colonization and different forms of oppression. I think from Desmond Tutu, there's so much that students were excited to talk about. One, I think, that stuck with them most had to do with self-care. Tutu talked about pulling away for retreats a few times a year where he would just go, he wouldn't talk, he would just sit and listen in silence, he would pray. He would take time for himself to allow the Holy Spirit to fill him up before he went out on a march, before he engaged in some form of protest that would be very emotionally draining, or before going into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was extremely exhausting for him. He didn't try to do it out of his own strength, which again I think was empowering and freeing for students to hear.
Anyone have a question of each other? No? I think it's interesting. I wish we did this more often, because I think our textbooks often intersect in so many ways. And students make those connections for us. They'll be like, oh, that's like when I read in Dr. So-and-so's class, this piece, or that connects to that. And I don't know about my colleagues, but that's like the greatest joy a professor can have is when they start integrating everything of their different courses and how they intersect.
I love seeing my colleagues appear in footnotes in their papers that they turn in, and you're right, comments in the discussion board.
All right, well, another aspect of our teaching, assignments. Those things that students are always happy to hear about. The ways that their work in the course will be assessed. And so the question is, can you name an assignment or two that you have incorporated into your teaching or plan to do so in the future that exemplifies the seminary's dedication to this transforming the world for justice with the holy? So a specific assignment or two would be helpful and give a little bit more information than just, oh, I'm going to have them write a paper on this. So, okay.
I'm happy to get us started on this one. Teaching in pastoral care and theology, a lot of my assignments I just make pretty straightforward. Develop a narrative Rolodex of resources that you're going to draw on in ministry and make sure that you're prepared to hit the ground running on that. But the one that probably speaks most to the question, again, I'm gearing up to teach for a second time an intensive course on political pastoral theology, which is a concept that ends up really tripping people up. What this is even? Everyone comes, what is this course even about? And we spend the entire time trying to figure that out, often with poor results. But the final assignment for that is an assignment that I've given a few different names to it, but it's essentially a synthetic pastoral theological intervention paper. And it has 4 parts, and I'm very sort of structured in this. Part 1, identify an injustice that is facing your community. Part 2, develop what I call a conventional pastoral intervention on that injustice, mostly focusing on interpersonal and dyadic sort of forms of responding. So anyone who took a pastoral care class probably more than 15 years ago, family systems, counseling type work. Section 3 is a political pastoral intervention, which is focusing more on a systemic, macrocosmic intervention into that injustice. And then the last section, which is the hardest, is explain to me how these pieces actually fit together, so that you're not simply doing a piecemeal approach of, oh, here's me being a therapist, and now here's me being an organizer, trying to actually force students to narrate in theological terms how these pieces are fitting together in response to an injustice. Is something that, again, everyone is left a little bit on their heels, I suppose, working through that assignment, but about half of the students who have done those projects for me have literally implemented them after they've left the course, so feel reasonably pleased with the outcomes of those ones.
Sure. Oh, that's all right. I can go next. Thank you. This was an in-class assignment that I had students do earlier this month in African Christianity, and it was a kind of a simulation, and the title was The Pastoral Consulting Firm, and the students had to split up into two teams where they went through different scenarios where there would be different pastors or chaplains who would come to them with concerns that they faced, and the students needed to think up kind of recommended solutions for these different pastoral crises, each of which had to do with different iterations of welcoming the stranger, but also having an opportunity to reflect on matters having to do with racism and colonialism, and whose theology is going to be considered normative, and whose theology has been marginalized. So these were not real scenarios, but they were kind of composite stories based on situations that had really happened with respect to African immigrants and refugees coming to the United States, trying to find their way in different Christian contexts and not always being welcomed. There were issues of cross-cultural misunderstandings and how people were able to get around those. And I think that having the opportunity to engage in this way was kind of a fun opportunity for students to think about important issues, and also to see how how history can be relevant to their actual real-life ministries.
I often have students write what I call, and they think of as journal responses to readings. And students express frequently vexation with, well, you know, I being asked, what is your opinion, and being pushed to take a position about things like abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment and so forth. And part of the reason I do that is I don't want them just to be able to say, this is what Miguel de la Torre said about this, or this is what someone else said about this. The examination, self-examination, the process of self-examination and self-regulation in discussion is really important pastoral skill or leadership skill in nonprofit work. But also, I don't want to just teach the history of ethics. I want it to be deeply personal as well as social and political. And so wrestling with questions of justice and just realizing that, nope, there's not somebody who's going to be able to tell you whether you're right or not, and what that means, and then what that means as an academic activity sometimes is really challenging, but that's a very important priority for me.
As a historian, and my students, I see some out here, always know the one question that guides me: so what? So what did it mean for those people at that particular time in history? And so what does it mean for us to learn about that today? And I think that question that guides the discussion, and, you know, Kazu, thank you for lifting up how important learning our history is to go back to some of that core trauma as a country, as a nation, as a denomination, as, you know, an individual, but it's history. And we have to, whether we like it or not, it's not always pretty, and it's not comfortable to learn about. And I think what I've really learned from one of the courses that I love teaching, the history of religion and social justice in the United States, where there have been times when the church has done some wonderful things on behalf of social justice. And there, unfortunately, are too many times when the church has failed miserably, even becoming complicit as a tool of the state to oppress people. And we have to learn from that history. And one of the things I'm finding, because I'm still the nerdy professor that assigns a research paper, and I really want students to, you know, delve into some of the primary sources and try to answer those questions. But I'm learning more and more, particularly in that class, students, I don't assign the topic, it's open-ended. You pick what interests you. And students more and more are picking up on local community history that impacts their children today. They're picking up on local community geographical settings that impacts their entire church community. Or they're picking up on a family history that somehow got overlooked, and now they're reclaiming it and the social activism that took place. And so those are the things I think that inspire me. And I'm really tinkering the next time I do that class to try to make some more of those so what connections with those papers, because those papers are exciting to read, to see how I've learned and I want to do better.
And I thought I could remain silent, but you all made me think of a couple of things. I teach a course on 8th century prophets and justice, and then I just taught the DMIN section this January, and it was on prophetic leadership. And so one of the exercises students do is write your definition of justice in 2 to 3 sentences. I do it too. I do it too. But just to help them understand that we throw that word justice around all the time, but we don't tell people what we mean about it or by that term. So the other thing I do with prophetic classes is, and also in my intro, is to help students understand that we fall into this dichotomy of, I'm going to be pastoral today and preach a pastoral sermon, and this week I'm going to be prophetic and preach a prophetic sermon, which translates into, I'm going to be comforting here and I'm going to be challenging and all those things that we associate with prophets. They forget that there were exilic prophets. Comfort my people is a prophetic voice that spoke to people in exile who had lost everything. And I had in my D-Min class this January a student who had served in congregational ministry for years, but had left that form of ministry and was serving in a adult care facility with working a lot with Alzheimer's patients and their families. And it was this one moment in class when she said, you know, I thought when I left the congregation I couldn't be prophetic anymore, because I'm not going to go in and tell these Alzheimer patients everything they need to do that they're doing wrong, we need to do it differently. And she said, oh, wow, I am being a prophet when I'm comforting, when I'm speaking words of hope. And so it's amazing to me, and all my students who've had me know that if you say, I'm going to be pastoral now, you're going to get at least the stink eye from me. And then a challenge of pushing back. And I wish we would think about that more often, is that we need prophets who do the comfort work, as well as prophets who might do the challenging work. And they decided you have to decide where you are in the timeline as to what your prophetic message needs to be. So that was all them, and it was one of those moments where you're like, I wished I had recorded that. So, all right. Anything else we want to add to that, to your responses, or ask anyone about? All right. Thank you all for sharing all those. I'm glad we're recording this, because I want to go back and get all this information later, so I know what I want to read. So here's another question, a little broader. What is one specific way you hope your teaching will equip students to lead more justice-oriented ministries? Or to broaden that out from ministries, but to lead more justice-oriented work and presence in the world? Because that might be your so what question, Dr. Barnett.
It does sort of hit on that. I think one of the things that I have, coming into theological education to teach as well, how, again, it goes back to that concept of power, how when the church got state-recognized power, they ran with it, and who gets to decide what's heresy and what's not at any given time is based really on a whim of who's in charge, right? And so this idea that depending upon who's in charge and who's in power determines the trajectory of what people should believe, and to push back then, and again, it goes to that so what question. So what do you believe and why? Explain that, articulate that. And I think that's one of the things I like helping disciple students prep for those regional committee on the ministry ordination interviews. You know, what do you believe? And how can you articulate that in a way that expresses our disciples' ethos, right? Because we don't come with, this is what you have to believe and how you have to believe. So opening up the classroom for multiple opinions and inclusion of all. And sometimes that's hard, and it's hard for students, because when we are critical of our early history of Christianity. We are critical of the Catholic Church, yet I don't want students to go out and be anti-Catholic. I don't want to be anti-Mormon. I don't want to be Islamophobic. I don't want students to be supersessionists that then contributes to this rise of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitics, action that we're starting to see. And so, language. And I'm really grateful that we at Phillips have this inclusive and expansive language policy where we can try to become more just-oriented with our words. And I've found myself just in the last few years, every time I hear, oh, man-made, no, human-made, humankind, let's broaden the words because words do matter.
Amen. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry, didn't mean to get preachy there.
I'll join you in a moment.
I can go next. In history classes here, we do end up talking a lot about Christian imperialism, times when Christianity has been inextricably linked with different forms of oppression, colonization, whether it's the Romans, the British, the French, the Americans. And I want my students to remember that this is something that's still ongoing. It's not just something that happened in the past where we need to remember, in 1492, X, Y, or Z. We need to talk about how what happened in the past continues to affect what's going on in the present and what we as Christians might be able to do about that. I remember in a recent class conversation, we had a long discussion about Christian nationalism and January 6th and how that relates to different expressions of Christian nationalism that we've seen throughout history, going back to the Crusades and before, looking at the colonization of Africa, how it's really kind of just a variation on a theme, and what our role is in pushing back against that. So.
We never stop in my class asking about what we mean by justice. That's just like an ongoing part of every course, every class session. There's nothing I love more than studying metaphysics of morals and theories of justice and things like that. And the place I have been in has been critiquing from outside the church. Though I personally am active in the church, the discourses outside the church about what social justice is, what counts as justice, and what actions make for a more just world, those are voices I want to be sure I'm bringing into the classroom too, even though we're in a seminary. So some of you have maybe seen The Good Place. Has anybody seen that series? Okay, and one of the hilarious things about that comedy is the very premise that maybe you can become a better person by taking a class from a philosophy nerd about ethics, right? I mean, that's a hilarious suggestion that's a part of that series. But I actually do believe in teaching ethics as a part of what helps us be more just people and communities and a more just world. And mostly what I want to communicate to students is, in my mind, ultimately there's really no difference between what I would call doing God's will, acting justly, and becoming a better person. All of those things for me are just different fingers pointing at the moon.
So, this question, what sort of justice-oriented ministries do I want to leave my students with? I know that I disagree with some people on this, and I'm happy to sort of lean into this, but teaching spiritual and pastoral care, a lot of the concern for me is around faith leaders going into very difficult crisis, trauma-focused scenarios involving various forms of abuse. And I think people do have a tendency to latch on to negative experience that they've had with clergy or various leaders, and really being committed to making sure that others do not reduplicate that. And one of, I will say, a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it an axe to grind or a fixation of mine that I feel unapologetically committed to is I'm very committed to making sure that my students do not unwittingly get co-opted by abusers, which I know it can be polarizing because it goes against a lot of our caregiving impulses. There are a lot of examples of this in the history of pastoral care. One of the classic traps that is now better identified is you're counseling a domestic abuse situation, and you're saying, oh, there are two people involved in this, and I know a little bit about marriage and family therapy. This is what I'm going to go to, which I see some heads sort of shaking, dear God, no, good. But that is a very natural sort of empathetic impulse that people have of, oh, these are two humans in front of me. I need to treat each of them on equal playing field because everyone has a voice. That is an example of trying to draw people's attention to ways that, again, I've had to say this is at least the second time, I'm not a sociopath. Like, I care for people, I want to give everyone their space, but one of the more humbling experiences that I've had in various sort of nonprofit, chaplaincy, faith-based scenarios are, there are persons who are looking to exploit your good faith efforts, and in fact are counting on it, and trying to orient students to the fact that I don't want you to come with a hermeneutic of suspicion to everyone necessarily, but you do need to be mindful of the fact that there are going to be persons who are hoping that you will fall into a trap that they lay for you. And I'm very committed to giving people eyes to see that. If they don't, there's very few things more tragic than a faith leader who does act in good faith, in kindness, in care, and who discovers too late, I have been pulled into a system that has actually made me an ally to the perpetrator of this abuse. That is absolutely mortifying. I'm very intent on equipping people not to fall into that trap.
Thank you to all of my colleagues. And since Dr. Bartonett brought up supersessionism, if there's one thing I have as my main goal of teaching Hebrew Bible is to prevent Christian misuse and abuse of the Hebrew Bible in the names of supersessionism or Christianity, as we might want to say, in which we think Jesus came up with everything he said from the get-go off the spot and had no Jewish training that led up to that. You know, love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus, people. And it goes on to say, love the stranger, too. So, you know, that was kind of an important thing. And the first one, love God with all you are, Deuteronomy. But we don't read those texts. We read the fun stories of Genesis and Joshua and Judges, as I mentioned, the fun stories. But I'm serious, because I think oftentimes so-called progressive Christians can do more harm in the areas of supersessionism unwittingly than those who are just blatant about it. And we have seen the rise of anti-Jewish violence in our country in the past few years. And as I want to say, Hitler didn't come up with the idea of blaming the Jews for everything. The church had been doing it for centuries. He just sowed seeds in the well-fertilized soil. So that's my only hope. If I can get students to walk out there and teach Hebrew Bible as having its own value and not always pointing to Jesus, I will rest in peace whenever I leave this earth and go wherever I might go next. Who knows? All right, that was my sermon. I thought we needed to bookend a Lisa sermon and a Lisa sermon. And oh, we have another Lisa over here. Would you like to have a sermon? Okay. We do have 3 Lisas on faculty, so quite fun. All right, bigger picture and a little different angle. What do you view as obstacles to teaching transformative justice with faith leaders in our present moment and context, or those who are studying to be leaders of communities. So what are some primary obstacles that you encounter along the way?
Well, I'll just name three quickly. One is what we've been focused so much in this conference on, which is kind of a cultural commitment to not doing self-examination, self-reflection, and self-regulation. So that's one. Another is, I just totally forgot the second one. So self-regulation, and then let me just say that, and then I'll let others say what you want to say, and then maybe I'll think of the second one.
Write it down if you do. If you're like me, that would help.
I have a couple. I think one I've already alluded to, which is just that so many faith leaders, especially those who care about justice, are discouraged, embarrassed, ashamed to be associated with Christianity because of those who have borne the name and perpetrated so many atrocities in the name of Christ. And there can be this idea of is there anything salvageable about Christianity? I think another is burnout related to just the magnitude and the volume of horror stories that are coming in from all around the world. It can be kind of paralyzing, where many of the faith leaders that I've encountered in the classroom and outside of the classroom just feel like, am I even going to be able to make a difference? And how do I know when I'm doing enough? Is it acceptable to be committed to one cause? Is there a way that I can be equally committed to all of them without just exploding? Where do I even start?
I think sort of along those lines, one of the things that I see in training theological leaders for the church or for social justice ministries is, and something that I try to emphasize in class that I think probably we need to tend to as a culture a lot more, differences in class and geography. We talk about differences in race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and gender identity, and those are all important, but I think we tend to forget some of the distinctions that do help fuel some of that rise in Christian nationalism come from different demographic groups. And I grew up in Blackwell, Oklahoma, and every time I go up, to see my mom, I am going into town and I see those farmhouses on the highway that have their Trump 2024 flags already flying proudly. And these are people I went to high school with, but they stayed. And I'm like, we have got to figure out ways to transcend some of the class and geographical differences. And I hate to say that urban-rural divide, because even small-town America is not necessarily rural America, but there is a whole different ethos in small-town America that exists, and how Christianity is practiced in small-town America versus an urban setting. And I think we need to do a lot more sociological studies on it, and conversations and teaching strategies. So,
Gosh, yeah, this is a hard one. I feel like I could go in 12 different directions, but I will say, Kazu drew attention to this in a few ways over the last 2 days. For me, thinking about again, focusing particularly on formation of students, trying to get everyone on board with working toward various forms of justice. I will say, I don't know how to put this any more eloquently than this. There is a major obstacle around people's self-perceptions of their goodness in relation to justice movements, where I know that this is, I'm not trying to take too much responsibility for the emotional states of others, but both within classroom settings and also I don't want to overstate any street cred that I have. I was involved in some movement chaplaincy circles in Nashville where I witnessed some really bad faith charismatic leaders who were very invested in being seen as central to the movement, who over a very short period of time really, well, they outed themselves to some and they ended up co-opting others. And it became very apparent to me in those moments, a very major obstacle to justice movements are people who are more committed to the idea that they are leaders of justice than actually seeing the outcomes that they are committed to, which is not an easy, and the thing that the reason why I think that it's so pernicious is because it is very difficult to discern who is actually committed to the outcomes, who is actually committed just to their self-perception. There are more than a few theologians who talk about what does it actually mean to carry this out faithfully versus trying to be perceived as just and as pious to others. But when I'm trying to engage students and myself on this, like a constant question that I'm asking, are you committed to the idea that you're one of the good ones? Or are you committed to alleviating suffering? That's a bit stark, and I know that boundary falls apart rather quickly, but that is a very unnerving thing to sit with. I'm constantly asking myself it. I'm trying to encourage my students to ask that question of themselves. It's an obstacle for a reason. I don't know if I'm going to outlive it, but it is, I feel, omnipresent in this work that we're doing. I'm open to suggestions.
That's really helpful because it helps me kind of articulate some things I wasn't prepared to say well before anyway. One is just the lack of relational skills in our culture. And the other is the lack of spiritual practice and spiritual health in our culture. And so when I think about what I mean by self-examination that I want students to engage in, I want myself to be thinking about how can I be a better person than I was a year ago, a more compassionate person, a more kind person, a more reflective person. And when, to the extent that I can't, can I at least engage in spiritual practice more so that maybe I can expand my bandwidth for stretching my comfort zone with that. And the other thing I really want people to think about, including myself, relates to something that Dr. Barnett said earlier about power analysis, which is another concept that I always want to be thinking about in my classes, and particularly the urge to dominate. And the urge to be the alpha or to dominate is not just about violence or physical aggression. It's also about wanting to be the most persuasive person in the room, the smartest person in the room, the person with the best reputation in the room, the person whose way sways the group. I mean, all of those are impulses for dominance. And I think it's connected with our spiritual practice, the extent to which we even can see that we're doing that ourselves.
I'm sorry. Oh my gosh. No, you have, I'm sorry. We're feeding off each other's energy. No, this is the thing that is, so, again, how difficult this is. Again, because I also had listed, I talk about authoritarianism a lot in my classrooms, and one of my other takeaways I could talk a lot about is, if nothing more, getting my students to be anti-authoritarian. If they can take nothing but that, then I've won. But I've won, interesting language. Victory. But this is one. But as Dr. McCallie said better than me, one of the reasons why I think that this is so tricky is that a charismatic authoritarian will completely confuse other people about what they're doing. And if I can just give one example of this that I've seen, again, in a few activist and faith settings, and again, this may ruffle some feathers, but this idea of, there's a major injustice that's plaguing a community, and perhaps a particular population was targeted at a recent violence, and then someone will come in and say, you know what, if we all just examine this, we realize that aren't we all equally responsible for what just transpired? Which, of course, there's a way in which that is true, But then there is I'm sorry, you're going to tell the population that was targeted by this violence that they are equally responsible for it? But notice, it is such an artful move that ends up completely diffusing a situation where the power dynamic could shift against you and convinces everyone that, you know what, the real problem that you have is that you aren't humble enough. If only you were sufficiently humble, you would realize that I am the leader that you need to follow. Faith leader, I will say, seminary, it equips people with some tools, and they're not always used toward the best ends. Everyone is equally at fault all the time for all things.
Yes. And oh, that word humility. How we like to say that word, and which basically means lay down and let me have my way trotting over you to get to where I want to be.
Precisely.
Yeah. I think I've taken humility out of my language. All right, so since we were talking about some of the obstacles, I want to give us a chance to talk about where you see some bright opportunities, some examples of how students, communities of faith that you're engaged with are actually working on this and intentionally doing the self-reflection, intentionally doing all these things that you've mentioned, maybe not all at the same time and certainly not realized, but I am curious to hear some of the things that might be inspiring to you to keep up the work.
I will just say that the students here inspire me and teach me all the time. And that's what I love about our class discussions and our not in class discussions, office discussions, that we share frustrations with the church, frustrations with society, but we also rally ourselves around hopefulness. And sometimes it's from a little spark that we read, De La Torre's Badass Christianity, book or whatever, that there is some spark and some life still left, and to take that out in the world. And I see, and the one thing I think about Phillips is so many of our students are already engaged in some form of ministry somewhere. And to see them take what they are learning here and putting that into practice in a current ministry setting, and then to be able to report back to classmates and to us on how this is working in small ways, incremental, it's not all at once change, but those incremental ways that somehow we are starting to transform the church in hopes that the church will transform the world.
I'll give you an example from 2 weeks ago. I was with a class of students from Phillips. There were 18 or 19 of us in Palestine and Israel, January 1st through the 14th. And one of the students, who was one of the younger students in the group, was able to articulate and stand firm at the end of the trip when he was asked why he had a Palestinian map and Palestinian literature in his suitcase by the security force at the airport. And to be able to say, yes, I do think, even though this literature uses the word apartheid in describing the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, that is a word that justice demands us to use in a very courageous setting. And so stuff like that, wow. Can't put a price tag on that.
I will signs of hope. I will say, not that I'm self-disclosing more than maybe I should. I'm prone to a little bit of despair from time to time, thinking about many things on our horizon, and I will say, not to be too hokey about it, but I am also inspired by students somewhat regularly. I try not to infect them with my despair, do my best to sort of insulate them to the best of my ability, but I will say that one of the things that continues to inspire is that they are just showing up and doing the work and bearing witness to the suffering of the world on a regular basis, where it is very remarkable, and I wish that I had a better explanation for it. But spending a semester or more, sometimes several years with a student, really plunging into, there's been a bit of mention of Miguel de la Torre, including, we read some of his work on the ethical and theological significance of hopelessness, which is a very fascinating thesis from a prominent Christian ethicist. So we can spend all this time really considering about the importance of actually sitting with hopelessness and sitting if anyone's familiar with Shelley Rambo's work, a trauma theologian out of Boston University, sitting with Holy Saturday before the resurrection, actually sitting there, dwelling in a moment of absolute unspeakable despair. We spend so much time with students, and then they go off and continue doing marvelous work in the world. And I wish that I had a better way of translating how those things are, how they can sit with one another. But the students at Phillips continue to bring their A game to the world, and that is something that I'm just sitting with my jaw on the floor, taking energy from that for myself and hopefully trying to pay it back into the community here.
You might notice I tried everything not to say hope in that question.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
For that very reason, you live
I
among
said
the
it.
prophets and the Psalms, and hopelessness is.
Yeah.
So, but thank you for calling that out, Brianna.
Oh, thank you. Oh my goodness, the students at Phillips are amazing. I'm still fairly new to the seminary. I've only taught 2 courses so far: History 1 in the fall, and then African Christianity earlier this month. And in the fall, when I had classes every week, I was always telling everyone, my students are the highlight of every week. Just their sense of call, their sense of passion. They know what they're about. They make so many sacrifices to be here. They inspired me every single time. I was so impressed with their ability to talk to one another about some really challenging, sometimes triggering, sometimes really just frustrating, painful, difficult, polarizing topics, and still engage with one another with respect, even when sometimes disagreeing about things that were very personal and important to them. Holding sacred space for and with each other, hearing each other out in a broader culture that doesn't include that so often anymore. And I found that so beautiful and encouraging, that the faith leaders that are being trained up here, many of whom are already working in ministry, others who are training for that purpose, they are modeling what it looks like to really be for people, even when you don't agree on everything. And I think we need more of that. So.
Any other things on that? I'm going to throw an extra question, another one, but it's really transitioning us to conversation with everyone here. Is there some question you would like to ask the people who are in the throes of doing justice work, ministers, other folks? Is there something you'd like to know from them that would help your teaching? You can ponder that, or you can say something right now. Is there a question you have for those who are gathered here?
I have a really knee-jerk reaction, which is, in the work that you're doing right now, what should we faculty be trying to help prepare students for? This is a constant question of mine that I'm perpetually revisiting. What are the things that I'm missing? I I don't think that there's my opening lecture for the Theory and Practice of Spiritual Care course is, you will inevitably curse your seminary for not preparing you for the work that you're doing, but I'm still going to try. So yeah, what are the things that you want to be on the radar of seminary faculty members to help at least prepare future graduates a little bit better?
So that's one question. Is there another one we want to have? And then I'm going to come and get your questions and your responses, however you want to share them.
One of the things I think in terms of activism and stuff, sometimes, my friend Phil Deloria gave a talk a few years ago at the Western talking about how sometimes we get into this identity politics that kind of resemble the 4 food groups. You know, we have to have an African American and a Latinx person and an Asian American and a Native American. Well, Phil says the Native Americans get left out of, you know, the group. But I'm wondering, instead of this focus on identity politics, if somehow how intersectionality can be more useful in transformative justice work with social movements, and how we can do better in teaching some of that intersectionality. Just a thought.
All right, if y'all come up with something else, Brianna or Kathy, I'll come back to you, okay? Or do you have some?
Pondering.
Okay, I know, I asked you a question that
That's
wasn't
right.
on the list. I'm sorry about that. So, either as a response to the question about what do you think we need to be teaching, or a response to Dr. Barnett's question about intersectionality, or if you have a question for the panel themselves. And I'm gonna play Phil Donahue, or I don't know.
Oh.
That just dated me, didn't it?
Yeah.
So, Sally Jesse Raphael.
There's some going.
At least I didn't say Geraldo, okay? So,
I'm trying not to recoil. My name is Anna Holloway. I'm a Phillips alum, and I am until recently was a assistant professor of many things at Langston University. So I ask this as an academic. The structure of the academy itself is essentially Eurocentric, essentially patriarchal, essentially hierarchical, essentially judgmental. How within that kind of structure, I mean, putting people of color, putting women, putting, like we're plugging and playing with different Lego blocks, doesn't change the structure and doesn't change the injustices that are inherent in the structure. So how as faculty and how as academics do you see your role in addressing those things? And believe me, I have asked this question of myself for many years, so I don't have an answer.
Well, I'll start, and then somebody can say something more helpful. Again, I mean, this is another of the animating questions of many decades of my life. I don't think I'm opposed to all hierarchies or even all dichotomies. And I do think there are some people's work I'd rather read than others, and would even make an argument that some people's work is more valuable to read than others. I hold that in tension with my deep belief of the sacred dignity and worth of every person. I also very much believe in institutions. So I'm not an anarchist. I believe in intentional structuring that's transparent and where leadership rotates. So I do think it's a big, big problem. And the elitism, the classism is a really big problem in higher ed. So I'll just start by saying that.
I will I'm not going to have anything better to say than that, but I will throw out a small anecdote in relation to this comment about not all hierarchies and institutions are bad. I was in my first semester of my PhD at Vanderbilt doing a degree in practical theology, and I was in a course that was co-taught by a practical theologian from South Africa and U.S. Queer ethicist, and people are talking about their affiliation, and sorry to let anyone down, I was not really raised in the church, and I kind of made this journey on my own and was sort of non-denominational, doing my own thing, and I said that with some pride in relation to others in that cohort who were very much more denominationally affiliated. Sort of, this is me being the anti-hierarchical, I'm going to pave my own way. And the white woman queer ethicist said, "Oh, that is a very cute thing for a straight white guy to be saying in this context." And I said, "Oh, that's a good burn." And it did. I will say that's been a little bit of a journey, and of course, there's such a thing as an overcorrection. Of course, for me, I'm, like I've hinted before, very as anti-authoritarian, as trying to create as accessible pathways for students as humanly possible. But like Dr. McCallie, like, we use letters, we use concepts, we use paper. There are things and tools that get used in multiple contexts that aren't inherently harmful because they are used in several different spaces simultaneously. So for me, I think that learning how to make good arguments is important, because I think that that's actually can be a really important tool for justice work, and there's nothing inherently wrong with conducting a literature review or making good arguments. You just need to make sure that you have a little bit of context and perspective about why it is that you're doing this, and that we don't become petty tyrants as educators and lose sight of the forest for the trees.
All right. Do you want to?
Oh, we got some more questions.
Well, I was
Okay.
going to ask a question.
Oh,
I was going to ask a question from chat, if I could.
Yes, I was going to say.
So,
Jay's gonna do that.
in the chat, we have a question of, in this difficult social climate, how should we do church differently?
Was that for the panel or everybody? Because I'd like to ask that of everybody.
I think that might be for everyone, but I'd love to hear from the panel.
because it's fresh on my mind, because I preached during the D-Min course week, Swami Abhedananda, who brought Hinduism to the institutes after the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 to train, wrote an essay, Why I Accept Christ, Jesus Christ, But I Reject Churchianity. And that churchianity, and he says that the way that we have focused so much on institutions and gotten away sometimes from the true teachings of Jesus, we have become institutionalized, and he says it's not Christianity, it's churchianity, and that's what we worship. And that has just stuck with me for a week now after preaching that sermon and including some of those quotes. And so I think part of it for people in the church is kind of because intention. What is our intention as a faith community? Is it to have this big building? If so, maybe we need to rethink why we're here in this community. That's my 2 cents.
All right.
Let me say real quick in answer to that question, I think my two historians here at my left remind me that one way we can do that is to study church history. Yes. Because when we say we want it to be different, do we mean than it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the United States? Yeah. Well, there are a lot of ways it's been different. And sometimes just to go back to the treasures that are in history is one way to look at that.
Thank you.
I'm Larry Garcia. Most of our congregations are older, many more conservative. Many, I would say, don't think they're ready for social justice. And how are we preparing students to be faced with congregations that think that giving to Week of Compassion is as much social justice as they need? And I mean, there is a practical matter here of getting these new students into congregations through search committees that are possibly even more conservative than the church itself.
I think that goes back to the issue of class and geography that I raised. The other book that I assign in Disciples History is from a New Testament scholar, Gene Boring's Disciples in the Bible, that traces the history of biblical interpretation within the Stone Campbell movement, because I think at the heart, when we use those words conservative and liberal, a lot of it comes down to how do people interpret the Bible and what hermeneutical lens. And so giving to Week of Compassion for someone might be social justice, and again, depends on how we define social justice, but can we pair that giving with some biblical texts to teach what social justice work is? And again, social justice work in Oakland is different than social justice work in Blackwell, Oklahoma. It really is. Not to say that there isn't social justice work that needs to be done in my hometown. Part of it, though, is education. I used to be a high school teacher, and I truly believe that part of the job of a pastor, too, is not just preaching, but it's also teaching. And there are ways in which you can spoon feed a little at a time, not all at once, but a little at a time for those incremental changes to help congregations think about social justice issues that are local.
And I might just say one thing, this won't surprise you as a Bible person, but I think, yes, Bible is important, but it's also, one of my hopes is students learn how to translate what they're hearing here and saying here into a different context. I tell them, don't get up the first day and say Adam and Eve never lived, unless you've already got your office packed up and ready to go to the next place. But you also don't need to stand up and say Adam and Eve did live. You can do it in gentle ways that expose people who think they're not ready for it, or sometimes I think pastors think the people can't handle it. And so we have to teach people, and trust that they can handle what we can handle.
Let me say two things real quick in answer to that question. One is there are some really good materials, text sample. A great resource for rural congregations has a book called Justice for the Common Good. Just a small book, a great book study book. But the other thing is, earlier when I said doing God's will, doing social justice, and becoming a better person, I really think those are all different ways of talking about the same thing. You don't have to talk about social justice, you can talk about love. It's that translating.
I know that one of the things that you all are doing as part of, seminary curriculum is getting people ready for ordination. How do you define and teach evangelism for the 21st century?
I haven't taught an ordination class yet, but okay.
I use this example we talk about it some in class, that commandment to go and make disciples doesn't mean that you have to use force and beat people or oppress them into conversion. And I think we misinterpret the biblical command in terms of the history of colonial mission work that has been done in the name of Christ. And I think, we in Discipledom, we kind of learned early 20th century that there might be different ways to present the gospel. And I go back to all that Kazu's been talking about in transformative justice, and hearing people's stories, those are sacred stories. Those are gospel stories. Those are good news stories. And sharing those stories is evangelism.
Thank you. Oh, certainly. Thank you. And thank you for priming the pump, Dr. Barnett. Sometimes I'm still processing the questions that I hear. But yeah, absolutely. In Mark, Jesus talks about how the kingdom of God is at hand, or we might say the reign of God is at hand, and to believe the good news. This is before Jesus had suffered and died, and before accounts of a resurrection. I know there are many contexts today where the idea of evangelism is, tell people that Jesus died for their sins. It's like, okay, but Jesus was already talking about the good news, the gospel, before he had died. And so the good news that the reign of God is at hand is something that we can be encouraging our students, current and future ministers, to be living into as they witness to the reign of God through different works of justice and compassion, of love towards people around them, towards affirming the dignity of marginalized individuals in communities. All of these are ways that evangelism can look in the present and in the future, and how it has looked at certain times in the past that we can call attention to. So, thank you.
I will just say, Dr. Wong and I have a similar mindset on this, so you're helping me also to think aloud. I am no biblical scholar and would quickly embarrass myself, and whenever I feel out of my depth, I just quote smarter people than me. I had the joy of taking New Testament from a person named Amy Jill Levine, who's pretty smart, and she had an extended lecture on the concept of euangelion, and really was the one thing that, and I really have to defer to her, but she was very insistent on the idea that in a first century Palestinian context, the idea of evangelism, if it did not include a material offering of sorts, some sort of material service or good, often something as quotidian as a tax break of sorts, then people would be confused about what you were even talking about. So in this concept, I would be inclined to flip the script slightly and say, okay, you're talking about evangelism, but you're not offering anything very material to actually alleviate the suffering of other people. What is it that you're talking about right now? Not to go on the offensive, but I will defer to others. Yeah.
And just drawing that out a little bit more, I think we've really misunderstood what people call the Great Commission. To go out into the world and make disciples can be understood to go out in the world and make learners. And I really don't think the goal is conversion so that the Jesus team has more people than the Buddha team or the Prophet Muhammad team. So I really think conversation, not conversion, is the mission of the church.
And I always tell students I don't convert anyone. God converts.
My name is Kelsey Cobbs. I wanted to answer your question about what it is that the seminary is not yet teaching.
Thank you.
I'm in my 6th month of full-time ministry, so I'm deeply in the part of the work where I have no idea what I'm doing. And I wish that seminary would have taught me how Robert's Rules of Order works.
Yes.
Or how or why, or if that is an effective way of collaborating with a group of people to try to help a church run.
I'm going to totally out our faculty. We don't know that.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Hey.
I do. I used to be a high school debate coach and did student congress competition and taught Robert's Rules of Order.
Okay.
And in the leadership and administration class that I teach consensus as an alternative to Robert's Rules, but I also have a book I've considered using, and you're inspiring me to put it on the list, called Roberta's Rules of Order.
Okay, half the faculty won't be able to help you on this.
Piggybacking on that, I was going to go back to the question you guys asked, and I would say we need to help people who are in seminary recognize that, recognize that church is not a place, and that specialized ministries should be and are and should be valued as much as congregational ministry, because church happens in the streets all the time.
Yes.
And that there is a lot to learn from the people on the streets. That just because we have a degree does not mean we know everything, and that we should be held up as better than the people through which we are doing ministry with.
Yeah, we know that Jesus spent all his time in churches. So, if you want to find him, yeah. Anything online? Okay.
Okay, I wanted to say exactly the same thing that Kelsey was saying. Although I'm not new into it, I was ordained over 25 years ago. And when I first got my first church, actually my first 2 or 3 churches, I was really mad at the seminary. I really was. Because every time I had to deal with something, I was like, the seminary didn't help me with this. I don't know what to do. And then my second church said, but you have an MDiv. You know what to do. And I'm like, no, I could tell you all the theology you want to know about it. But then I go back to, and I went to Phillips when it was in Enid. And Dennis Smith was teaching a class on storytelling of John. He was writing his book on John. And he brought in Barbara, his wife, to teach us how to tell the stories. And that was the best class ever, because it was both the theology and now and the now what. Mm-hmm. So it would be cool if every class had some aspect of, okay, this is what you need to know. Now, this is how you can plug it in and use it. And I, for one, I imagine just about anybody else who's ordained in here, would love to come and tag with you all. Because, you know, it's unrealistic for us to say seminary professors who are not preaching on Sundays or dealing with Robert's Rules of Orders or how to get out of a committee or what to do when you're trying... Unplugging a toilet. Oh my gosh, I have to do all that too. Yes.
Yeah.
We are humans.
Helping with the budget and some of those practical stuff that I was like, I didn't know I was supposed to do all this stuff, but I do it gladly. It just took, but a lot of it have to do with leadership styles that I was not taught. I had to learn on my own instead of, I don't pull it out of anybody. They don't pull it out of me. We go on the journey together. And that's why I'm in a very healthy ministry. I've been at my church now 17 years because we do it together, where my other churches were shorter term because they were like, well, you do it. And I'm like, but I don't know what to do. When I have a homeless person that comes in and they escort them out, or when I'm trying to do a homeless ministry when I was in New Orleans and they said, how can we stop this from happening in our church? When I looked at them and said, it's not your church, it's God's church. That relationship was gone. But I didn't know what to do. So that's, let's tag together. Experience with the theology and all that stuff, I think would be great because it's not just on the seminary's responsibility. So, I'm
Michael, I've already invited you to audit my disciples history class in August. Anyone can audit any of our classes, by the way, or, for a 2-3 day weekend or a week-long course or something. Or we can just bring you in.
I was going to say, I think he's talking about not auditing,
but
collaborating.
No, I definitely think, and that's one of the reasons why I continue to volunteer to go out on Sundays and do pulpit supply at a lot of different churches to meet people and to meet congregations and to kind of try to stay connected to, it's not the Real World of Ministers, or the Real Housewives series that gets aired at the regional level, but it at least gives me a glimpse into different congregations and styles, and, you can learn a lot in one Sunday from different personalities that greet you when you come to do pulpit supply. So that's why I try to stay connected, but I definitely think more collaboration within the region is good.
I see the president rising, and since I know where my bread is buttered and all those things. I would like to thank you for your participation, and if you have other things you would like for us to know, please find a faculty member and talk to us. And we will try and find you and talk with you. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues. Let's give them a round of applause.
Don't you really wish you could come to seminary again, though? Thank you all so much. I'm really proud to know you. Proud to know you. Thank you. I'm on intellectual overload. I'm pretty sure that you all are as well. So here was our thought about the evening. We have a wonderful group of caterers, again, who have prepared a lot of food in what we have come to call the living room down right outside the library. And we have librarians who are quite willing to show you around the completely remodeled and beautified library that they were very much involved in helping us do that in a way that was good for them too. My suggestion is that the concert begins at 6:30. I don't know about traffic. It will take about 20 to 25 minutes if the traffic isn't too bad to get to Faith United Methodist Church, where the sound system is 100,000 times better, even though we've spent a lot of money, and y'all have done great working on the sound. Back behind me, I'm going to take a moment, back behind you in front of me, are Zach and Jay, just two members of the team who catch balls when it's related to IT, regardless of when and from where and how they are thrown. And I'm grateful, grateful, grateful for the work you all do. Thank you. So, having already said that, so please, you've got time, breathe. Spend time together. There's so much food down there that even though we said heavy hors d'oeuvres, our intention was to give you enough food to go through the evening, because we end up, when we buy lots of meals, we end up wasting so much food. So we're trying this as a way of feeding people, but without, hopefully, not wasting so much food. So, and then make sure that by 6, that you find your way to Faith United Methodist Church. And there'll be some written directions for those of us who are technically challenged. There'll be written directions to Faith outside. Thank you all. Thank you all for this great day. 9 o'clock tomorrow. 9 o'clock tomorrow, we finally get to tell Kazu what we really think.
Oh, yes, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I was like, oh, we have